Adventures of Harry Nile.
Chapter 1. It was a suffocating, cloudless Tuesday afternoon in August, the kind of day where the Seattle heat bakes the grime right into the pavement, and the air in my office feels thick enough to chew. The sun was beating relentlessly against the frosted glass of my door, casting long, sharp shadows across the scuffed floorboards. I was staring at a lukewarm cup of coffee, wondering if my bank account was as dry as the weather. When she walked in, she did not arrive in a sleek luxury sedan, and she wasn't draped in expensive furs. She came off the street looking like she had walked a dozen blocks in the blistering heat. Her tailored blue suit wilted at the shoulders, and her breath coming short. Murphy, my associate, gave me a look from the outer desk that clearly said this one was going to be trouble. I ignored the warning and motioned the woman toward the rickety wooden chair opposite my desk. She sat down hard, clutching a small leather handbag, like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. Her name was Evelyn Cross, or so she claimed. She had a story about a missing husband, a friendly poker game that stretched too late, and a sudden, inexplicable disappearance on the waterfront. It was a standard, nickel-a-dozen sob story, delivered with all the appropriate tears, but something about her delivery was fundamentally flawed. People who are genuinely panicked tend to trip over their words, their thoughts scattering like dropped marbles. Evelyn was reciting hers perfectly, hitting every emotional beat, like a seasoned actress who had rehearsed the scene all morning in front of a mirror. She finished her tale by sliding a single, crumpled matchbook across my blotter. It bore the faded logo of the Blue Owl, a notoriously rough dive over by the shipyards that absolutely did not cater to gentlemen playing friendly hands at stud poker. She insisted her husband had never set foot in a place like that, but claimed she had found it stuffed in his spare coat pocket the morning he vanished. I picked it up. The cardboard was damp with nervous sweat, and it smelled faintly of cheap gin and stale sulfur. I told her my rate was $50 a day plus expenses, half expecting her to flinch. She did not blink. She just reached into that tight little handbag and pulled out 3 crisp $100 bills. Innocent people with missing husbands usually haggle or weep. People paying for a cover-up just hand over the cash before the detective can change his mind. I slipped the bills into my desk drawer, struck a match to light a cigarette, and watched the smoke cut through the stagnant air in the room. I told her I would see what I could find out, and she thanked me, standing up to walk back out into the unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun. I sat there for a long time, rolling the Blue Owl matchbook between my fingers, knowing she had lied to me about almost everything, and wondering exactly how much this case was really going to cost me. Chapter 2. The heat had not broken by the time I left the office. The late afternoon sun had just baked the city into a harder crust. I left Murphy in charge of the fan and took my DeSoto down to the waterfront. The air down by the docks was a thick soup of diesel fumes and hot asphalt. The Blue Owl sat wedged beside a defunct cannery, looking like a place where dreams went to die. There was no owl, just a neon sign with half the glass tubing busted out, so it buzzed like an angry hornet. I pushed through the warped door and let my eyes adjust. The inside smelled of stale beer and desperation. It was barely 5, but the regulars were already hunched over the mahogany bar, like gargoyles. I found a stool near the end and waited for the bartender. His name was Elias, a guy with a face like a dropped pie and a memory that was strictly cash and carry. I had done him a favor involving a stolen shipment of Canadian rye a few years back, and he usually remembered it when the price was right. Elias wiped the bar in front of me with a rag that looked older than the building. He gave me a slow nod. I asked for a rye neat and slapped a $10 bill on the scarred wood next to the crumpled matchbook Evelyn Cross had left on my desk. Elias poured the drink, his eyes lingering on the bill, then the matchbook. I asked him if a guy named Arthur Cross had been drinking in his establishment over a weekend. I gave him a quick description, based on the photograph Evelyn had conveniently provided. Elias scooped up the 10 with the smooth motion of a practiced pickpocket. He leaned in, his voice a gravelly whisper that barely cut through the hum of the busted neon. He told me he remembered the guy, not because of the sharp suit, but because he was sweating like a stuck pig and checking his watch every 2 minutes. Arthur Cross had indeed been at the Blue Owl on Saturday night, but he was not playing friendly hands of poker. According to Elias, Cross sat in a back booth, nursing a single gin and tonic, waiting for somebody. I took a sip of the rye. It tasted like iodine and regret. I asked who Cross was expecting. Elias polished a glass and glanced nervously toward the back. He said he did not know the guy's name, but he was a heavy-set bruiser with a flattened nose and a cheap linen suit. They did not shake hands. Elias recalled that the bruiser slid a thick manila envelope across the table. Cross opened it, looked inside, turned pale, and shoved the envelope into his coat pocket. They left together shortly after midnight. I thanked Elias and headed to the booth. The leather was slashed in 3 places, and the table was sticky. I sat down and looked around. From this angle, you could see the side exit that led straight out to the alley. I checked the floor under the table. Nothing but peanut shells. I slid my hand along the crevice between the seat cushion and the wooden frame. My fingers brushed against something hard and flat. I pulled it out. It was a claim ticket for the luggage room at King Street Station. The date stamped on it was Saturday. The exact night Cross was supposed to be playing cards with friends. It was a neat little piece of cardboard that told a completely different story than the one his wife was selling. A man planning to go home to his loving wife does not usually check a bag at the station at midnight. I put the claim ticket in my pocket and walked back out into the sweltering evening. Evelyn Cross had handed me a carefully constructed lie, complete with a prop matchbook, to point me in the wrong direction. She wanted me to think her husband was a poor innocent sucker who got in over his head. But the claim ticket suggested Arthur Cross was packing his bags and planning a getaway. The only question now was whether he had made it to the train, or if the guy in the linen suit had cancelled his ticket permanently. I started the engine, listening to the familiar rattle of the exhaust as it coughed into life. I drove toward the station, determined to pry open the luggage locker and see exactly what kind of deadly baggage Arthur Cross was trying to leave behind. Chapter 3. King Street Station was humming with the late-night crowd, a restless ocean of tired commuters, sailors on leave, and desperate drifters looking for a place to sleep out of the heat. The high-vaulted ceilings bounced every footstep and echoed off the tile, turning the terminal into a giant stone drum. I walked past the ticket counters, keeping my hat tilted low to avoid any overly friendly faces from the local precinct. The luggage room sat near the north exit, tucked behind a heavy iron counter where an old clerk with thick glasses sat reading a folded newspaper. I tapped the counter with my fingernails. The clerk did not hurry. He finished his article, took off his specs, and wiped them on a greasy necktie before squinting up at me. I slid the claim ticket across the scarred wood, along with a silver dollar. He did not say a word. He took the ticket, checked the number, and turned around to wander back into the maze of floor to ceiling wooden shelving. 2 minutes later, he returned carrying a beat-up leather Gladstone bag, dark brown with scuffed corners, and a brass latch that had seen better days. He dropped it on the counter with a heavy thud, picked up my dollar, and went right back to his paper without looking up. I hauled the bag over to a wooden bench in the corner of the waiting room, out of the direct line of sight from the main entrance. The latch was locked, but a bent paperclip from my jacket pocket made short work of the cheap mechanism. I popped the lock and pulled the leather sides apart. The smell of cedar, faint tobacco, and stale linen drifted out. I braced myself for money, drugs, or maybe a bloody shirt, but the contents were startlingly mundane at first glance. There were 2 neatly folded dress shirts, a spare pair of trousers, a shaving kit, and a small stack of train schedules for the northern lines, heading toward Canada. I dug deeper, pressing my fingers along the bottom lining, until I felt a stiff rectangular shape hidden beneath the fabric. I sliced the seam with my pocket knife and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. It was a pocket account book, packed with dense rows of names, dates, and figures going back 3 years. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the entries. These were not the records of a tool salesman or a casual gambler. They were a detailed record of systematic extortion. Payments, dates, and amounts were meticulously logged beside initials. Halfway down a page from 6 months back, a familiar set of initials jumped out at me. EC beside. It was the payout amount that made my eyes water. Arthur Cross was no mere victim. He was a blackmailer, and his loving wife Evelyn was right at the center of his ledger. She had not come to my office to find a missing husband out of devotion. She was looking for her cut of the loot, or trying to recover the ledger before someone else found it. A man who squeezes people for a living, builds a long list of enemies, and any one of the names in this book could have put a bullet in him and dumped his body in the Sound. I snapped the book shut and shoved it into my inside coat pocket. As I closed the Gladstone bag, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You get a feeling when you are being watched. A cold prickle right between the shoulder blades that tells you to move. I looked up casually, catching the reflection in the polished marble pillar opposite my bench. A tall man in a dark trench coat was standing near the newsstand, pretending to examine a magazine, but his eyes were fixed right on me. Even in the dim light of the station, I could see the broad shoulders and the flattened, crooked bridge of his nose. It was the Blue Owl's bruiser. I did not wait for him to make his move. I hoisted the leather bag, stood up, and cut sharply toward the side exit, leading out to the tracks. The iron door groaned open, spilling me out into the heavy night air. The heat hit me again, smelling of coal dust and creosote. Behind me, the heavy door slammed shut, followed immediately by the rapid, heavy crunch of leather soles on gravel. I ducked into the shadows between 2 stationary freight cars, slipping my hand inside my jacket to feel the reassuring cold steel of my snub-nosed revolver. The hunter had followed me from the bar, but he had just walked right into my dark corner. Chapter 4. The gravel crunched closer, measured and slow. He was taking his time, trusting his bulk and the gloom between the boxcars to do his work for him. I pressed my back against the rusted corrugated steel of the freight car, listening to the heavy rattle of his breathing. Over the distant hiss of a steam engine, the heat trapped between the trains felt like an oven, making sweat trickle down the back of my neck. I slipped my fingers around the wooden grip of my snub-nosed revolver, easing it out of the holster without making a sound. He rounded the corner of the boxcar, his heavy shoulders blocking out what little light spilled from the station platform. In his right hand, resting loosely at his side, was a short length of lead pipe wrapped in black friction tape. It was an ugly, brutal tool, designed for quiet work behind dark alleys. He stopped 5 feet away, his small eyes squinting through the shadows, trying to pick me out from the dark iron. I stepped out from behind the doorframe, bringing the barrel of the revolver up until it was leveled squarely at the center of his chest. The metallic click of the hammer cocking sounded like a gunshot in the narrow space. He froze, his broad face tightening as he looked down at the dark circle of the barrel. He did not drop the pipe, but he stopped advancing. I told him to take 2 steps back and keep his hands where I could see them. He grunted, a low sound deep in his chest, but he complied, shuffling backward into the faint yellow glow of a distant yard lantern. I asked him who he was working for and why he was tailing me from the Blue Owl. His nose was as broken and crooked as Elias had described, giving him the look of an over-the-hill prizefighter who had taken one too many left hooks. He let out a short, wet laugh that sounded like gravel grinding in a bucket. He told me I was poking my nose into business that was going to get it bitten off. He said Arthur Cross was a dead man walking the moment he decided to play both sides of the street, and anyone trying to clean up Cross's mess was going to wind up in the same shallow grave. He claimed he did not know who I was, but he knew I had the Gladstone bag, and his boss wanted everything inside it, returned before the weekend. I took a step closer, keeping the gun steady. I asked him about the manila envelope he had handed Cross in the back booth of the bar on Saturday night. The bruiser's eyes flickered, just for a second, glancing toward my coat pocket where the leather-bound ledger was resting against my ribs. He realized then that I had already opened the bag and found the real payload. He shifted his weight, his fingers tightening on the lead pipe. I warned him that I would put 2 holes in his linen suit before he could swing that pipe halfway to my skull. He eyed the distance between us, measuring the odds in his head, then decided he did not like the math. He spat on the gravel, turned slowly, and began backing away toward the open yard. He told me I had until tomorrow morning to drop the bag at the foot of the dock on Washington Street, or my secretary would be the one paying his boss's invoice. The threat about Murphy hit me like a splash of ice water. Before I could pull the trigger or demand a name, he ducked behind the coupler of an oil tanker and sprinted into the dark expanse of the rail yard. I started after him, but the screech of a moving switcher engine cutting across the tracks blocked my path, spouting a wall of white steam and iron. By the time the train cleared, the yard was empty, leaving only the smell of coal smoke and burning oil. I squeezed the revolver back into my holster, my heart hammering against my ribs. The bruiser was not just a hired heavy, he was a messenger, and his boss was someone who knew my office and my routines. Evelyn Cross had brought me a bogus story, but the real play was already moving fast around me. I grabbed the Gladstone bag, cut through the side fence, and ran back toward my DeSoto. I needed to get to a phone booth and make sure Murphy was still sitting safely at her desk before somebody decided to settle Arthur Cross's account in my office. Chapter 5. I shoved 2 nickels into the slot of a sticky phone booth near the corner of Jackson Street, my hand shaking slightly as I dialed the office number. The line rang 3 times, each tone sounding like a ticking bomb, before Murphy's sharp, professional voice cut through the receiver. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding. I told her to lock the frosted glass door, draw the blinds, and go home early for the night. She started to ask questions, her sharp mind picking up the edge in my voice. But I cut her off. I told her I would explain everything in the morning. But for now, she needed to stay off the streets and out of sight until I cleared the air. Once I hung up, I stood in the humid booth for a moment, watching the headlights of passing sedans cut through the haze on the glass. The bruiser's threat meant the game was moving faster than I was. I walked back to my DeSoto, tossed the Gladstone bag onto the passenger seat, and climbed behind the wheel. The car started with its usual rusty groan. I did not return to Pioneer Square. Instead, I drove up into the residential hills toward the address Evelyn Cross had given me for her home. It was a quiet, tree-lined street in Capitol Hill, where the houses were set back behind manicured hedges and stone retaining walls. The Cross residence was a 2-story craftsman, with dark wood siding and a wide front porch. Every window on the ground floor was dark, but a faint, yellowish glow spilled from an upper window near the side. I parked half a block down, under the shadow of a large elm tree, turned off the engine, and let the quiet of the neighborhood settle around me. I gripped the leather ledger in my coat pocket, flipping through the mental notes I had made back at the station. The ledger showed extortion payments going back 3 years. But the most interesting entries were the recent ones. Arthur Cross had not been taking money from strangers. He had been bleeding people who lived in his own social circle. The timeline Evelyn had given me claimed her husband went missing Saturday night after playing cards. But the claim ticket at the station was stamped at midnight. On that exact same evening, someone was lying about where Arthur was supposed to be, and the answer was sitting right inside that dark house. I stepped out of the car, keeping my footsteps quiet on the sidewalk. I walked up the stone steps, leading to the front porch, avoiding the creaky wooden boards near the top. The front door was heavy oak with a small brass lock. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my lockpicks, and set to work on the cylinder. It took less than 30 seconds before the brass tumblers clicked into place, with a soft, satisfying pop. I turned the knob, eased the door open just enough to slip inside, and shut it soundlessly behind me. The hallway smelled of expensive floor wax, fresh lilies, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that made the hair on my arms stand up. I drew my snub-nosed revolver and moved silently along the hardwood floor toward the faint light spilling down the staircase. The house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic dripping of a faucet somewhere in the kitchen. I took the stairs one by one, keeping my weight close to the wall, where the steps were least likely to groan under my boots. At the top of the landing, the master bedroom door stood half open. The light was coming from a small brass desk lamp, sitting on a secretary desk in the corner. Papers were scattered across the Persian rug. Drawers were pulled out and left hanging, and the mattress had been yanked off the bed frame. Someone had torn the room apart, looking for something in a hurry. I entered the room, my gun leading the way. Then my boot nudged against something soft lying on the floor, beside the overturned desk chair. I looked down. It was a man, sprawled on his back with his arms pinned beneath him. He was wearing a sharp double-breasted suit, but the front of his white shirt was ruined by a wide, dark stain that had already dried into a dull rust color. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. I knelt down and pulled a leather wallet from his coat pocket, flipping it open to the driver's license. The face in the photograph matched the man on the floor, and the name printed beside it was Arthur Cross. Chapter 6. I checked Arthur Cross for a pulse out of habit, but the chill, settling into his skin, told me he had been dead for hours. The entry wound in his chest was clean, delivered from close range by a small caliber weapon that had left faint powder burns on his lapel. This was not the work of a blunt instrument, or a drunken brawl in a back alley. It was a precise, calculated execution, carried out right in his own bedroom, surrounded by the wreckage of a search that had failed to turn up what the killer wanted. I stood up slowly, keeping my gun ready, as my eyes scanned the scattered papers on the rug. Bills, receipts, personal letters. Whoever had tossed the room had been looking for the black ledger resting safely inside my jacket pocket. The killer knew Cross had kept a record of his extortion ring, but they did not know he had already packed it into a Gladstone bag and checked it at King Street Station before coming home to meet his fate. A faint sound downstairs made me freeze. It was the distinct metallic click of a key turning in the front door lock, followed by the soft creak of a heavy oak door opening. Footsteps crossed the hardwood floor of the foyer below, light and deliberate, heading toward the staircase. I stepped back into the shadows beside the high-backed mahogany wardrobe, pulling the bedroom door back to its original half-open position and holding my breath. The footsteps mounted the stairs, taking them with a steady, unhurried rhythm that suggested the visitor felt entirely at home. A slender figure crossed the threshold into the dimly lit bedroom, pausing briefly as her eyes landed on the body sprawled beside the desk. She did not scream. She did not gasp or drop her leather handbag. Evelyn Cross simply stood there, looking down at her dead husband with a cold, detached expression that held no trace of the frantic, tearful woman who had walked into my office just 5 hours earlier. She walked calmly over to the body, knelt down, and began searching the inside pockets of his jacket with practiced efficiency. When she found nothing, she let out a quiet sigh of frustration, stood up, and smoothed the front of her tailored blue skirt. That was when I stepped out from behind the wardrobe, the snub-nosed, revolver leveled at her waist. She turned smoothly, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the gun, but her composure returned almost instantly. I told her to keep her hands where I could see them and step away from the corpse. She obeyed without a word, crossing her arms and leaning back against the edge of the overturned desk, as if we were meeting at a cocktail party rather than standing over her murdered husband. I asked her why she had hired me to find a man she knew was already dead. The tearful routine about the Blue Owl and the friendly poker game had been nothing but a smokescreen. She had needed a private investigator to dig into Arthur's recent movements and find where he had hidden his extortion records before someone else got to them. She had used me as a bird dog, sending me out to sniff out the ledger while she waited for the dust to settle. Evelyn smiled faintly, a bitter, cynical twist of her lips that made her look 10 years older under the yellow lamplight. She admitted Arthur had been squeezing the wrong people for years, but insisted she had not pulled the trigger. According to her, Arthur had come home late Saturday night, terrified, claiming he had made a deal to sell his ledger back to one of his primary victims for a massive payout, only to discover he had been double-crossed. She claimed she had left the house on Sunday to stay with a friend when Arthur refused to hand over his cut of the blackmail money to her, but her timeline was already crumbling. The claim ticket I had recovered proved Arthur was at the train station checking his bag at midnight on Saturday, while the bartender at the Blue Owl had seen him meeting a heavy-set man with a broken nose at that very same hour. Evelyn was trying to weave another web of half-truths, but she did not realize that I held the one piece of evidence that proved her entire story was a fabrication. Chapter 7. I kept the revolver leveled at her midsection, the metal cold and steady in my palm. The bedroom light flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls. Evelyn didn't flinch. She watched me with a calculating detachment that felt more dangerous than a loaded gun. I told her the game of charades was over. I had Arthur's ledger, the one she had sent me to find, and it was currently cooling its heels in my coat pocket. She didn't look surprised. Instead, she looked hungry, her gaze darting toward my chest like a predator stalking a wounded rabbit. She began to pace slowly, keeping a calculated distance between us. She started talking, her voice dropping into a register that sounded like honey poured over shattered glass. She claimed she was the victim in this domestic tragedy, a woman trapped in a marriage that had turned into a prolonged hostage situation. She argued that Arthur had been planning to sell the ledger to the highest bidder, a group of shipping magnates who were eager to erase their past and then disappear with the money, leaving her to take the fall for his decades of systematic extortion. She painted herself as a woman who had finally fought back to save her own skin, but the coldness in her eyes didn't match the warmth of her excuses. I didn't buy the damsel act for a second. I pressed her on the bruiser with the flattened nose, the man I had tangled with at the train station. I asked if he was the one who had come to the house to handle the ledger transaction. Evelyn hesitated, her composure cracking for a fleeting heartbeat. She didn't have to answer. Her silence was a neon sign pointing directly to the man in the linen suit. She insisted she knew nothing about him, that Arthur had his own shadowy circle of associates, that she was never invited to meet. It was the same old song, just played in a higher key. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy, stagnant night air. It was a reminder that the world outside this bedroom was still ticking away, and that Arthur's body would not stay hidden forever. I told Evelyn that the police were going to be knocking on this door within the hour, and that her best bet was to start telling the truth, if she wanted to see a lawyer instead of a prison matron. I asked her who had actually squeezed the trigger. She looked at the blood on the rug, then back at me, her face hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated steel. She laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that lacked any mirth. She suggested I was naive, if I thought Arthur was the only one inch of the family who knew how to play hardball. She didn't admit to the killing, but she didn't deny it either. She hinted that Arthur had been warned repeatedly to stop playing games with the wrong people, and that he had finally crossed a line that no amount of money could uncross. She was telling me, without saying the words, that she had been present when the trigger was pulled, or at the very least, she had stood by and watched the light go out of her husband's eyes. I kept the pressure on, asking about the bruiser's employer. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed, her shoulders sagging as if the act of deception had finally drained her of all remaining strength. She finally admitted that the heavy with the broken nose worked for a local contractor, a man named Vane who held several city leases and had been one of the biggest names in Arthur's blackmail ledger. She warned me that Vane didn't just handle problems, he erased them. If I thought I was holding an ace with that ledger, she said, I was sadly mistaken. I was holding a target. I lowered my gun just an inch, my mind racing through the implications. Vane. The name sounded like a gust of wind, but it carried the weight of a freight train in Seattle's backrooms. If Evelyn was telling the truth about Vane, I was already walking in the shadow of a man who owned half the city's concrete and all its secrets. I needed to get out of that house and get that ledger to a place where not even a man like Vane could find it. I grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the door. She didn't struggle, but she leaned in close, whispering that if I stepped out of that house, I wouldn't make it to the end of the block. I told her I'd take my chances, hauled her downstairs, and left her standing in the foyer, just as the distant blue lights of a patrol car turned onto the quiet, suburban street. Chapter 8. The blue lights of the police cruisers flickered against the wet leaves of the elm trees. As I cut through the side alley behind Evelyn Cross's house, I slipped through a break in the cedar fence, keeping low until I reached my DeSoto parked 2 blocks down. The engine caught on the second try, coughing a cloud of grey exhaust into the damp night air. I did not waste time looking in the rearview mirror. Evelyn was going to have a lot of explaining to do when the patrolman found Arthur's cooling body in the upstairs bedroom, but I had a bigger fire to extinguish before the entire city went up in smoke. I drove down to the industrial district near the Tide Flats, pulling into an all-night diner near the Ray Yards to use the payphone in the back corridor. My fingers were cold as I dropped a coin into the slot and dialed the number Evelyn had reluctantly surrendered. It rang 4 times before a gravelly, familiar voice answered on the line. It was heavy with a broken nose, sounding as sharp and awake as a watchdog on a chain. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him I was holding Arthur Cross's black ledger, the one with every payoff, date, and name neatly logged in black ink. I added that Arthur was lying on his bedroom rug with a bullet through his heart, and that the police were currently combing the carpet for fingerprints. There was a long beat of silence on the other end, heavy with calculating hostility. The heavy grunted, demanding to know what my price was for keeping the ledger out of the prosecutor's hands. I gave him a dry chuckle, letting him hear the cold conviction in my voice. I told him I was not looking to become a martyr for Arthur's bad debts, but I wanted $50,000 in cash and a clean ticket out of town before sunrise. I set the terms with absolute authority, a midnight rendezvous at Pier 54, down among the rotting timbers and salt spray of the waterfront, where the fog was rolling in off Elliott Bay. I warned him that if he brought an army of thugs or failed to show up with the satchel, the ledger would end up on the police chief's desk by breakfast. He agreed, with a sinister growl, and hung up the phone. I left the diner and drove through the darkening streets toward the docks. A low, penetrating drizzle had begun to fall, slicking the cobblestones and turning the neon signs into blurred streaks of red and yellow along the avenue. Pier 54 was a dark, cavernous structure, jutting out into the black water, smelling of creosote, dead barnacles, and wet hemp. I parked the DeSoto 3 blocks away, slung the heavy Gladstone bag over my shoulder, and approached the pier on foot, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the wooden pilings and stacked cargo crates. The dock was quiet, except for the rhythmic slap of waves against the wooden supports and the distant moan of a foghorn out on the sound. I checked the cylinder of my snub-nosed revolver, ensuring 5 live rounds were seated properly, then slipped it back into my coat pocket, where my hand could rest on the grip. I climbed a rusty iron ladder, leading to a disused overhead catwalk, overlooking the main staging area of the pier. From up here, concealed behind a pile of damp canvas tarpaulins, I had a clear view of the entire length of the dock and the single hanging incandescent bulb that illuminated the center of the floor. 10 minutes before midnight, the heavy crunch of boots echoed across the wooden planks below. A shadow detached from the darkness, entering the dim yellow pool of light under the hanging bulb. It was the bruiser in the linen suit, his broad shoulders hunched against the damp chill, his hand resting conspicuously inside his coat. But he was not alone. Stepping out behind him from the shadows was a second man older, impeccably groomed in a tailor-made trench coat, carrying a leather briefcase. I recognized the sharp profile from the newspaper clipping in my office. It was the prominent city contractor himself, come to personally oversee the destruction of his dark past. I tightened my grip on the revolver, took a deep breath, and prepared to drop the net over both of them. Chapter 9. I stepped down from the overhead catwalk, my boots making a slow, deliberate thud on the damp wooden planks of the pier. The fog was rolling in thick off the sound, swallowing the distant lights of the harbour and wrapping the docks in a cold, grey shroud. Under the single unshaded bulb hanging from the rafters, the contractor and his crooked-nosed muscle stood waiting, their silhouettes sharp against the murky night. The heavy hand went into his coat, the second my heels hit the deck, but I already had my revolver out, levelled square in his middle. I told him to keep his fingers clear of his piece unless he wanted a lead belly button. The contractor raised a gloved hand, signalling his man to stand. He was a slick piece of work, mid-50s, with sharp blue eyes, a silver mustache, and a jawline carved out of solid marble. He adjusted the lapels of his tailor-made trench coat and gave me a smile that held all the warmth of a butcher's freezer. He set his leather briefcase down on a salt-crusted crate and asked if I was the big-time private eye who had been playing games with his reputation. I did not bother with small talk. I pulled Arthur Cross's black ledger out of my pocket, holding it up so the yellow light caught the scuffed leather cover. I told him this little book held enough dirt to sink his construction company, put him in a cell at Nile Island, and strip the silk right off his back. The contractor laughed, a smooth, cultured sound that echoed off the damp pilings. He opened his briefcase just enough for me to see the thick stacks of $100 bills, banded in white paper. He told me he was a practical man, who knew the price of doing business in a town like Seattle. He said Arthur Cross had been a greedy amateur who did not know when to stop squeezing. He admitted he had paid the heavy to buy back the ledger at the Blue Owl, but Arthur had panicked, taken the manila envelope full of hush money, and then pulled a fast one by checking the book at the station. When the contractor realized Cross was planning to keep leading him even after taking the lump sum, he sent his muscle back to Arthur's house to collect the goods by force. But they had arrived 20 minutes too late to find the book, and 20 minutes after Arthur had already taken a bullet. That was the line that snapped the last piece of the puzzle into place. The contractor had not killed Arthur Cross. He was too smart to pull a trigger himself when he could hire muscle, and his heavy had been scouring the city for the Gladstone bag all afternoon. The man who had actually put a bullet through Arthur's heart was someone who knew Arthur intimately, someone who wanted the blackmail ring for themselves, and had tried to pin the whole bloody mess on a prominent mark. I looked the contractor dead in the eye, and told him his money was no good to me tonight. His smile evaporated, replaced by a dark, dangerous scowl as he shifted his weight on the wet planks. I told them both that, while they were busy running around town looking for the ledger, Arthur's loving wife Evelyn had been sitting in my office, setting up the entire board. She was the one who had tipped the cops off about Arthur's record. She was the one who had tried to use me to find the book, and she was the one holding the small caliber gun that matched the hole in Arthur's chest. The heavy growled, taking a half step forward, his patience wearing thin under the cold drizzle. But before he could draw his weapon, a sharp whistle pierced the fog from the dark end of the pier. Footsteps pounded against the heavy timber as 3 uniformed patrolmen, backed by a couple of plainclothes detectives, materialized out of the mist, their service weapons drawn and ready. I had called the precinct right after leaving the diner, making sure the law arrived just in time to catch the whole crew with their hands in the till. The contractor stood frozen, his slick composure finally shattering into sheer panic as the steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. I tucked Arthur's ledger inside my coat, holstered my revolver, and turned my back on the noise. I walked away into the swirling fog, leaving the cops to sweep up the mess. Knowing there was still one last account, I had to settle with the widow before the night was through. Chapter 10. The heavy oak door of the precinct house swung open, spilling me back out into the bitter pre-dawn chill of the Seattle waterfront. The drizzle had finally tapered off, leaving the pavement slick and glistening like polished obsidian under the dull street lamps. The docks were quiet now, save for the solitary whistle of a tugboat cutting through the thick wall of fog drift off Elliott Bay. I paused on the granite steps, pulling a crumpled pack of Chesterfields from my pocket. My fingers were stiff and cold, but I managed to strike a match against the stone, holding the small flame in my cupped hands until the tip burned orange. I drew the bitter smoke deep into my lungs, letting it settle before exhaling a long, grey plume into the freezing air. Upstairs in the detective bureau, the typewriter keys were still clacking away, hammering out the official statements that would bind the night's chaos into neat, legal paragraphs. The city contractor was sitting in a holding cell, his high-priced attorneys already furiously dialing judges, while his bruised enforcer sang like a canary to the homicide squad. Evelyn Cross had finally broken down in the interrogation room, when the ballistics report confirmed that the small-caliber bullet dug out of Arthur's chest matched the nickel-plated revolver tucked deep inside her vanity drawer. She had killed her husband for the ledger, hoping to inherit his lucrative blackmail empire and slide smoothly into a life of luxury. Instead, she was looking at 20 years to life in a grey concrete box down at the women's facility. I walked down the steep slope of Washington Street, my trench coat pulled tight against the damp wind, blowing off the salt water. My heels clicked a slow, rhythmic beat against the cobblestones, the only sound echoing in the deserted downtown corridor. Up on the third floor of the accidental street building, the office windows were completely dark. Murphy was fast asleep in her Queen Anne apartment, safe from the dark underbelly of the city that I spent my nights navigating. She would show up at 9 sharp, brew a pot of strong black coffee, and ask me if the case had been worth the worn-out shoe leather. I would tell her what I always told her. The rent was paid for another month, and that was about all the justice a man could expect in this town. There were no winners in such a business. Arthur Cross was 6 feet under a cold patch of mud. Evelyn was going to rot in a cell. The contractor's empire was crumbling into a heap of public scandal, and the small-time thugs who greased the wheels were heading to McNeil Island. The world did not get any cleaner or brighter, because I had spent the night dodging lead pipes and breathing diesel exhaust. The rain-soaked streets of Seattle were still crooked, filled with desperate people, chasing dirty money and making terrible mistakes in dark rooms. Tomorrow another client would walk through my frosted glass door with a tearful story, a handful of crumpled bills, and a fistful of lies, and I would take the job because it was the only thing I knew how to do. I reached the DeSoto, parked near the corner of First and Yesler. The dark metal was beaded with heavy droplets of dew that reflected the dull yellow neon of a nearby 24-hour diner. I tossed my spent cigarette butt into the gutter, watching the tiny red embers fizzle out in a puddle of muddy water. I unlocked the sedan's heavy door, settled into the cold leather seat, and pulled the starter button until the old engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life with a familiar, rattling growl. I pulled out into the empty street, turning the nose of the car toward the dark hills, leaving the waterfront behind me as the first faint, grey light of a bleak dawn began to creep across the Seattle sky. Chapter 11. The city was still asleep while I pulled the DeSoto into the alley behind my building, but the darkness was losing its hold, turning into that pale, chalky grey that washes over Seattle right before the morning sun decides whether to show up. I killed the engine and sat in the quiet cab for a long minute, letting the heat from the radiator die out while the cold crept in through the floorboards. My bones ached with that deep, dull weariness that whiskey cannot touch and sleep only postpones. I picked up the leather-bound ledger, resting on the seat beside me. It was lighter than it had felt 6 hours ago, just a bundle of ink and paper that had cost 2 men their freedom and 1 man his life. I took the back stairs up to the 3rd floor, my boots heavy on the wooden steps. The hallway smelled of old cabbage and cheap floor polish from the night janitor's bucket. I unlocked my office door, stepped inside, and did not bother turning on the overhead light. The faint dawn was already filtering through the frosted glass, cutting diagonal slashes across the dusty desk and the wooden chairs. I walked over to the window and pushed it up a few inches, letting the damp, salty air from Elliott Bay sweep away the stale haze of yesterday's cigars. Down on the street, a milk wagon rattled past, the horse's hooves clacking against the wet cobblestones, like distant gunfire. It was the start of another day for people who worked honest shifts and went home to families that did not lie to them. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, pulled out the $300 Evelyn Cross had handed me on Tuesday, and laid the bills flat on the blotter. It was good money, but every cent felt dirty. She had bought my time to cover her tracks. In the end, all she had purchased was a one-way ticket to a state penitentiary. I sat down in my swivel chair, pulled out my iron desk safe from beneath the counter, and dropped the black ledger inside before spinning the combination dial back into place. The city prosecutor would be calling by noon, wanting to take a look at it, and Lieutenant Butterfield would probably show up with a fresh pot of terrible precinct coffee to gripe about the paperwork. But for now, the ledger was locked in the dark where it belonged, surrounded by old case files full of broken promises and forgotten debts. The outer door latch clicked, and I heard the light, familiar brush of footsteps across the waiting room floor. Murphy walked in carrying a paper bag from the bakery down the block, her coat unbuttoned against the morning damp. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight of my rumpled suit, the faint smudge of smoke on my lapel, and the empty chair where Evelyn Cross had sat just 3 days ago. She did not ask if I was okay, nor did she ask how the story ended. She had been around this office long enough to read the outcome in the lines around my eyes. She pulled 2 porcelain mugs from the cabinet, set them on the edge of my desk, and poured fresh coffee from a thermos she had carried up from the street. Steam rose between us, smelling of roasted beans and warm chicory. She told me that a man from a maritime union had called at 8, looking for someone to check into a missing payroll box down at Pier 42. She left the note on my blotter, picked up her mug, and walked back out to her desk without a word. Pulling the inner door shut behind her, I leaned back in the creaking chair, picked up the hot mug, and looked out the window as the first pale yellow rays of sunlight finally broke through the clouds over Mount Rainier. The rain had stopped, but the streets below were still wet, reflecting the grey sky like a dull mirror. The city was awake, ready to turn the page and start the whole ugly cycle again. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, reached into my pocket for my last loose match, and lit a fresh cigarette, waiting for the phone to ring.